Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our Unit 6 lectures on the consequences of industrialization. In particular, we will be looking at the Ottoman and Russian empires. So, let's think back to what we have been learning. We learned about new imperialism in Asia and Africa. But what about Latin America? What's been going on in Latin America? Today, we are continuing to talk about empires, but instead of talking about our maritime empires, like the British, French, or even American systems, we will be looking at land-based empires, specifically the Ottomans and the Russians. So this aligns with topic 6.5 of our AP course description, economic imperialism. So you'll be able to explain how various economic factors contributed to the development of the global economy from 1750 to 1900. And you should focus on how economic factors from the Ottomans and the Russians impacted the global economy and ways that the global economy impacted the Ottoman and Russian economies. So, land empires. All right, let's talk about the Ottomans. First of all, the Ottoman Empire is in decline by this point. If you remember, the Ottoman Empire has been around since, the 14th century. We know that it was really at its height in the 16th century. It starts with Mehmed II and the conquering of Constantinople in 1453. That's a real turning point in history for us. Well, during the medieval period, the Ottoman Empire is the power in the Mediterranean, right? It's the Ottoman Empire that partners with the Venetians to make them so rich economically. It's the Ottoman Empire who is the biggest threat militarily to Europe. It's the Ottoman Empire's military and economic superiority that motivates the Spanish and the Portuguese to look for another way to do trade with China, and will ultimately lead to the discovery of the Americas. However, we're long past that. We're like 300 years past that, and things are not going so hot. With the discovery of the Americas, but then more importantly, the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman Empire really starts to fall behind and decline. If you remember, the Ottoman Empire does not practice primogeniture. So primogeniture is the practice where the eldest son, right, the firstborn male, is the automatic heir to the throne, which is great in Europe. I mean, sure, it leads to a lot of wars, but it also means you always know who's going to be the next king. Well, in the Ottoman Empire, you don't have this. You have these unclear rules of succession. And so the Sultan has a harem full of wives and concubines. Actually, 0 wives. The Ottoman Sultan never actually married. Harems full of concubines who have lots of children. So the question is, which of these concubines' children will be the next Sultan, will be the next king? And it's not clear. So you end up with sort of Game of Thrones situations with assassinations and intrigue and poison and lying and manipulation and all this stuff. So that means the energy of the political elite is not focused on governing the country. Rather, it's focused on getting your heir in power. You also have lots of weak and corrupt rulers. And in part, this is because more powerful people would place a weak heir in the throne, so then they can manipulate power from the sidelines. So you have tensions within the royal family. Because the royal family is not focused on governing, it means you have more reliance on the vizier, right? The kind of like the chief of staff. And that means you have more corruption. In general, we've talked about before, when you have the royal family of an empire focused more on luxury and their own sort of small circle and less on actually governing the country, that's when things start to really go badly. You also have the challenges of how does Sharia law, how does Muslim culture and the legal system that goes along with it, a legal system established under 7th century nomads, right? If you think about Muhammad and the culture in which he came from, how does this legal system work in the 18th century, work with trains and a modern world? We see an impact economically as well. So because of the rise of British goods in the Industrial Revolution, you have less demand for the handmade goods that would come out of Turkey. Cloth, rugs, things like this. So this will cause economic crises in the Ottoman Empire. You also have internal fighting. So if you look at this map, you can see how much of the map was once part of the Ottoman Empire, right? The red dashed line shows how large the empire was in 1807. Well, by the 20th century, it's basically just the Anatolian Peninsula. You will first lose the Caucasus region and Crimea. So let me show you, in case you don't know your geography, you should. All right, Caucasus region. That's where like Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan is, and Crimea. So in the late 1700s, all of this was part of the Ottomans as well. But Russia is going to expand and take it. Then in 1820, you'll lose Greece, part of our wave of revolutions. Then the Serbs. And then in the early 20th century, you are going to have the Balkan Wars, which will really lead directly into World War I. In general, the only reason why the Ottoman Empire survives to World War I is because the Europeans led it. No one conquers it. It is a useful tool for the British and the French to wield against Russia. So the Russian Empire is expanding, it's getting more powerful, and they're very concerned about it. They don't want Russia to have access to the Mediterranean, right? The fact that they have access to a warm seaport in the Black Sea is problematic enough. So Western Europe will support Turkey militarily, economically, will support the Ottoman Empire rather, to help it limp along, to help it survive. But it will be known as the sick man of Europe. So, what about Egypt and Napoleon? Well, you might be thinking, why are we talking about Napoleon again, right? We talked about him last unit. Well, Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798, and his goal is to eventually get to the Indian Ocean and conquer British India. What he does with this is it really just demonstrates Muslim vulnerability to European power, right? He conquers Egypt with 36,000 men and 400 ships. So prior to this point, everyone was still sort of thinking of the Ottoman Empire, because of course Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, as this monolith, still sort of thinking of them in how strong they were in the 16th century, when really they are no longer that powerhouse. And Napoleon's actions really demonstrate this. The European superiority of artillery use is really going to be no match to the Egyptians' spears, muskets, and cavalry. Well, we know that eventually the British will take control of Egypt. While we've already talked a little bit about Egypt, we'll talk about a little bit more. but this really marks as a turning point in the power of the Ottomans. So if you remember, we talked about Egypt. We talked about Muhammad Ali already, about how he is going to attempt to modernize and industrialize Egypt, but the British won't let him. So he'll break away from the Ottomans in 1805. I'm sorry, I know I'm missing a number there. 1805. He had ruled Egypt as an Ottoman governor, but had imperial ambitions. And in fact, his descendants will rule Egypt until 1952. So he will try to industrialize with the help of European advisors. He'll adopt French practices. He wanted Egypt to be less economically dependent on the Ottomans, importing advisors and technicians. He will build cotton mills, foundries, shipyards, weapons factories. And to pay for this growth, he would have peasants grow wheat. Then the government would buy it at a low price and export it for profit. But the British will force Egypt to participate in a free trade agreement, and their new burgeoning industrial economy could not compete with the British system. So the Egyptians will be forced to become economically dependent on the British buying their raw materials. What about in the Ottoman Empire itself? Well, now Europe is stronger and more powerful than the Ottoman Empire. This is flipped from the medieval period when Europe was the weak one and the Ottomans were the strong ones. Sultan Selim III will really attempt to reform the Ottoman Empire to try and strengthen it. He is going to attempt administrative and military reforms to increase efficiency, but this will anger the Janissaries and the officials. So if you remember, the Janissaries were once the elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire. This is what made them so powerful and cutting edge. Well, over time, the Janissaries had become an inherited position. They had become an institution that was very conservative and resistant to change. So, Sultan Selim III wanted to make the military more of a European style, with military weapons that were more modern, and the Janissaries were not for this. They didn't want to lose their privilege by the creation of new military units. Selim also wanted to bring provincial governors under central control and standardized taxation. But the ulama as well, if you remember, the ulama are the Muslim scholars, also didn't like the reforms. They distrusted any form of secular law and taxation systems. So Selim III will actually be deposed and killed in 1807. In 1811, you will have the Wahhabi rebellion. So the Wahhabi rebellion is designed by the Muhammad ibn Abdul Awwab. He's trying to strengthen the Ottoman Empire by returning to traditional Islam and Sharia law. So Wahhab is a Saudi family living in the Arabian Peninsula, and his rebellion will lead to Saudi control of Mecca and Medina. So it's a further loss of power and influence for the Ottomans. And the loss of their two most holy cities is embarrassing, frankly. They can no longer really call themselves as like the center of the Muslim world if they don't even control Mecca. You then have Sultan Mahmud II, different from Mehmed II. Mehmed II conquered Constantinople. Mahmud II is going to institute reforms. He will overthrow the Janissaries using a secret army and European help in 1826. And he will utilize Western models to institute the Tanzimat reforms. This is an important reform effort in the Ottoman Empire. These reforms are designed to restructure the Ottoman Empire to move towards civil law instead of a legal system controlled by the religious elite, and designed to make this now more secular system more efficient, specifically for the military and the bureaucracy. Now, these reforms will be paused in the period of the Greek rebellion and Muhammad Ali's rebellion in Egypt, but those rebellions really demonstrated why we needed reform efforts. So, let me go over what the reforms had included in them. So, it will introduce a parliament, an attempt at a constitution, making the Ottoman Empire a constitutional monarchy, public trials and equality before the law, regardless of religion. So prior to this point, Muslims would be tried under Sharia law, Christians would be tried under Christian law, Jews would be tried under Jewish law. There wasn't a single united legal code. Depending on what your religion was, it would impact the punishment for a crime. There'd be new rights of privacy, new forms of tax collection. Sharia law would be limited to matters of family law, like marriage, inheritance, adoption. He will, in fact, even send soldiers to Europe for training. And when they return, he will build schools for an army, medical schools. But he quickly realizes that for these schools to be effective, they are going to need earlier schooling. They need to have students who already know how to read and write and do math and stuff. So this will cause there to be more schools open for children. And during this time, French will become the lingua franca. This reform effort takes a long time. Look at that time period, right? 1839 to 1876. This is not happening overnight. And not everyone likes it or is in favor of it. There were debates among members of the Ottoman government regarding the various economic and political reforms. Europeans, of course, are going to like it. Oh, you're becoming more like us? Finally. We're the best. Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire will like it because it will give them more rights. Muslims will be worried, especially the ulama, the Muslim elite, the scholars, because it will be a direct threat to their power. So this is an attempt to use laws and decrees to unite really diverse populations. And it will also result in changes to culture, right? Istanbul is becoming more cosmopolitan and more European. In 1831, you have your first Turkish newspaper, and then there's lots more. You suddenly have people starting to shave their beards, and you have the emergence of sort of European-style headgear. So let me show you. Where's my little guy? Okay, so you see this hat right here? It's called a fez, right? It's typically felt, and it's just a cap. There's no brim. Well, it's directly modeled after the European style cap, right? A military cap where it's like da da da, and then like here's the brim. I'm an amazing artist, clearly. Well, they adopted this style from the Europeans, but quickly realized that it wouldn't work for them as Muslims because the brim of the cap would keep them from being able to touch their forehead to the ground during their daily prayers. So the fez emerged as an adaptation of a European-style cap. They kept the shape, but they just removed the brim, so then during your daily prayers, you could still touch your forehead to the ground. In general, you see clothing moving away from traditional dress to a much more European style. Women still had few legal rights, no job opportunities, but could continue to manage their own property. So the reforms will strengthen the state, but many of the sultans will view the reforms as dangerous, as a threat to their power, and will in fact be resistant to implementing them. Western educated bureaucrats and liberal military officers will clash with the sultans and the conservatives of the Ottoman court. Later, Ottoman rulers will in fact rely on foreign loans to boost the economy, but this will make them economically dependent on Europe. And so you even have men like Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He is going to really be an authoritarian ruler. He traveled around Europe in his 20s, learned a lot, especially about agriculture. He started as a constitutional monarch. If you remember, Mahmud really instituted a constitution. And when Abdul Hamid II takes power, it's under that regime, but he quickly ditches the constitution. He nullifies it and begins to restrict civil liberties. He's trying to control a fracturing state. You have rebellion in the Balkans, a lost war to Russia, fighting with Greece. The Ottoman Empire is now the sick man of Europe, and then Europeans are starting to ask and talk about this Eastern question. How do we divide up the Ottoman territories among the European imperial powers? Right? So he's aware of this, and this is the pressure under which he is working. And rather than trying to make his country more European, he's going to try and return to tradition, right? This goes back to that question I asked in an earlier lecture. Can you modernize without westernizing, right? He doesn't want to become another European state. He wants them to remain Ottoman, but he wants them to be more powerful. So he will build up infrastructure, railroads, telegraph lines, and this will connect the far-flung regions of his empire. He will reform the bureaucracy and judicial system, making them more secular, and will open up professional schools so you could become like a professional plumber. He's dealing with bankruptcy conditions and Muslim refugees fleeing from the Balkans. He sees the British invading Egypt and reacts with just more authoritarian rule and oppression. He will censor the press and meetings. He will use secret police to institute his plans. He will use the Kurds to persecute and massacre the Armenians. This will set a precedent for the Armenian genocide later. So you will have what's known as the Young Turks. The Young Turkish Revolution of 1908. So the Young Turks are a nationalist reform party, and they will overthrow Hamid. Made up primarily of young military officers, they were concerned about the weakness of the country, for instance, the loss of territory to Europe in the Balkans, and the need for modernization. So they're motivated primarily by a need to preserve the state, right? Hamid and these Young Turks have the same motivation. We want the Ottoman Empire to survive. So they will force the Sultan to restore the constitution, and he will be implemented again as a political figurehead and authority on religion only. But when a revolution broke out, he was accused of being behind it and exiled. The Young Turks and the Ottoman Empire will really just collapse after World War I. So all of these attempts at reform ultimately fail. All right. I want you to identify 3 reasons why the Ottoman Empire was in decline. Okay, so Crimean War. The Crimean War was a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, fought primarily on the Crimean Peninsula. You might think, okay, what's the big deal? It's just a little bit of land in the Black Sea. Who cares? Well, the rest of Europe cares. Remember how I mentioned the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, and then there was the Eastern question. The Eastern question was which European states get the Ottoman territory when the Ottoman Empire finally collapses. Britain and France didn't want Russia to get that territory. So when you have Russian expansion southward, the British and the French will send troops in to support the Ottomans. So, in general, Russia has been expanding their territory, and they have an ongoing intense relationship with the Ottomans. You have going back and forth control of the Black Sea. Russia always wants a warm water port. So, the reason why there's a war is, frankly, pretty dumb. Let me see if I have it on the next slide, or if I just tell you. All right, so here's Crimea. Right, yeah, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, French, British, Austro-Hungarian. All right, so we're just talking about this area. Interestingly enough, this is the same area that has been disputed, and fighting has been happening there for the last several years because Crimea is part of Ukraine, and Russia invaded it under sort of irredentism laws and claimed it as their own. So, one thing to note as well, you can't really see it, but right down here, there is there's Jerusalem, right? So Jerusalem is in the Ottoman territory. Well, every year there is someone appointed to be the protector of the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre is the church in Jerusalem where where Christ was supposedly crucified. Now, I admit, I don't know how frequently they are appointed. Either way, there's some guy, some religious European dude who is always going to be appointed as the protector of the Holy Sepulchre. Well, it was supposed to be a Russian dude, but instead a French dude was picked instead. And this upsets Russia. So Russia invades, so it's essentially Romania, expecting support from Austria and Britain because they would be putting the Ottoman Empire out of its misery and taking control of the land. Ultimately, they want to take Constantinople because if you remember, the czars of Russia sort of see themselves as a continuation of the Byzantine Empire. The real cause, however, is nothing to do with who has an honorary title. It's Europe negotiating power. If it's territoriality, right? If the Ottomans continue to exist, that's one thing, but if they don't, who gets the land? Britain was worried that Russia would get the land, and their monopoly on the Black Sea would hurt Britain more. They're also concerned that it might limit their ability to get to their Eastern Empire. So, Russia had fallen behind the West in terms of technology and trade, and were still predominantly agricultural. So the Crimean War will be fought on the Black Sea after Russia provokes a conflict with the Ottoman Empire regarding the Holy Land. In the end, Russia will lose because the West, Britain and France, is much more technologically advanced. It's not that the Ottomans have the technological advancements to win, it's that they get supported by Britain and France. This will ultimately convince Tsar Alexander II to institute reforms in Russia to help Russia keep up with the rest of Europe's military superiority. The war itself, Russians lost the land battle but won the naval one. In general, you see a lot of incompetent leadership on all sides. But the Russian loss is pretty embarrassing. So what's the impact? Well, the Tsar will already be under fire because people wanted liberal reforms, and this is going to further weaken the power of the Tsar in Russia. In Europe, we see massive propaganda campaigns in favor of the war. This is the first time that the media is used to drum up support for a war. And it's really going to set the stage for what will happen in World War I. Lots of villainizing the enemy and, portraying your own boys as heroes. The press in Europe will make it seem like the Ottomans did nothing and it was all the British, showing up and saving the day. But the Ottomans lost lots of troops in this fight. We also see a distinctive shift from traditional to modern warfare. No more cavalry, instead firepower. There's a very famous poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson that we normally listen to in class. It's called The Charge of the Light Brigade, and it tells the story of this cavalry group that essentially rides straight into gunfire and cannon fire, and they all die. So they decide, cavalry no longer working. It's also the first time that war information is being sent in real time, telling of the plight of the citizens and the brutality of the war, thanks to the telegraph. During this war as well, you have Florence Nightingale, which is a name you might recognize just from culture. She was known as the Lady of the Lamp. She was a nurse, and she would make rounds caring for wounded soldiers at night. She becomes sort of the icon of Victorian culture and will start a nursing school in London and advocate for healthcare reform. The Ottomans will see an increase in involvement with European commerce. Whether they want to or not, this is kind of the flip side to Europe helping them win. This will allow some of the Ottomans' larger cities to expand, and an urban professional class will begin to emerge. We also see lots of refugees, Muslim refugees from Eastern Europe arriving in the Ottoman Empire as well, forced out by Russian expansion. However, in the end, commercial and urban growth can't save the Ottoman Empire. The government is extremely dependent on foreign loans. They end up lowering the tariffs for Europe to try and get more trade. They import lots of goods but export very little, so they're at sort of an economic disadvantage. It's not going to be able to slow the tide of the Ottomans' decline, and World War I will serve as the death knell. Okay, let's talk about Russia. So, here's the thing you got to remember about the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire has basically not changed in many ways since the medieval period, right? The biggest change was Peter the Great, but his changes were really only clustered in a few big cities in the western part of Russia. Russia still has a system of serfdom. It still has very little industry, few factories, few steamboats, few railroads. If you were to go out into the sort of countryside in Russia, life there would basically be the same in many ways as it would have been in the year 1600. So Russia's weakness is just that. It's so backward. It's mostly agricultural. It has no transportation infrastructure. You have few large cities, so lots of small villages. And it's enormous, right? So without those things, without transportation infrastructure, without communication infrastructure, it's great. You have a huge empire, but can you really utilize it? So as far as industrialization in Europe, you see some changes, some steamboats and railroads, and the British will help set up some textile mills. But this is really limited. First of all, industrialization requires educated and independent-minded artisans and entrepreneurs. And the Russian system of power has really never allowed that to flourish, right? You basically had the boyars, the nobles, and serfs. There's no independent artisan class that can create their goods and invent new things. None of that is rewarded, and there's very little education in Russia as well. Tsar Nicholas I will really fear literacy and education, in part because the liberals liked it and and in part because he preferred serfs to factory workers, right? He's going to look at some of the protests and the conflict in Western Europe with unions and anarchists and see this as more trouble than it's worth. Serfs know their place. He'd rather import goods and make it itself. However, Russia always has had a strong sense of self. They are Orthodox in faith. They use the Cyrillic alphabet. So you have Slavophiles, right? Russian intellectuals in the early 19th century who favored resisting Western European influences and taking pride in the traditional peasant values and institutions of the Slavic peoples. So sort of the three main parts of life in Russia is orthodoxy, a peasant lifestyle, and the Tsar's absolute rule. Remember, in most of the 18th and 19th centuries, you see the European absolute monarchies transformed into constitutional monarchies, not in Russia. In Russia, you still have an absolute monarchy, and the Tsar holds absolute power. So Russian expansion took them across Asia, even to the border with China. They will eventually set up a port on the Pacific Ocean and take control of Central Asia, specifically the Caucasus Mountains, Georgia, Armenia, which is going to be predominantly Christian, and Azerbaijan, which is predominantly Muslim. They start moving down into Afghanistan towards India, which will really scare the British. They will be concerned that Russia will expand into India. They will end up fighting with the British over Afghanistan. So, Russia before reform. Well, if you remember, Napoleon's going to try to invade Russia in 1812, and that's going to be a failure thanks to Russia's winter. The fact that he tries, though, creates a need for a new line of defense. So in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Tsar Alexander I will promote a holy alliance. Russia, Prussia, and Austria would combine to defend Christianity and halt revolutions. Many Russian intellectuals and elites would be fascinated by Westernization. And you are going to see that Alexander I will ultimately begin to institute some reforms. Right after the Crimean War, he realizes, we need to make some changes. These are going to be pretty limited reforms. Things to make it a little bit less absolutist. For example, you have the Decembrist revolt, which will happen after the death of Alexander I. So the Decembrist revolt is going to be an attempt of the army to take over the Russian government. Army officers will be encouraged by Tsar Alexander I's liberal reforms. And in the Napoleonic Wars, they saw the hardships that peasant soldiers had to go through. So these army officers are frustrated with the shallow, vapid court life versus the reality of most Russians' lives. They would support freedom for the serfs and realizes most other nobles didn't care. So they are going to lead a revolt. Now, this is an upper class revolt, right? They are going to be influenced by the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. So when Alexander dies, the army has to swear allegiance to Tsar Nicholas I, right? This is pretty standard transition of power stuff. Well, the army's going to refuse. So instead, they are going to support a constitutional monarchy and say that Alexander's brother, Constantine, should be Tsar. Constantine doesn't want to be Tsar. He doesn't care. The fact of the matter is they thought other troops would join them, that these officers would make a big stand and everyone would be like, oh yes, this is our moment, and join them, and you'll have a turning of the tide. And it doesn't work. No one joins them. So you have an hours-long standoff between 3,000 rebels and 9,000 loyal troops. Eventually, Nicholas I shows up and sends an emissary, and the rebels will shoot this messenger, right? Don't shoot the messenger. He tries to negotiate with them all day, no luck. Eventually orders the artillery to open fire, and it's a slaughter. All the leaders will be arrested, tried, and eventually executed. And this is really going to set the tone for Nicholas I. He was never really in favor of liberal reforms anyway, but in his mind now, this is what liberal reforms lead to: violent insurrection, treason. So he's going to be responding to all sort of liberal reforms with violent repression. He will implement regulations to stop the spread. He'll use a network of spies and informers. So under Nicholas I, schools and the press will be supervised, political opponents arrested, the secret police will be active, and his goal here is sort of to prevent Russia from being influenced by the West, to preserve sort of these social norms. He will tighten the labor obligations on the serfs instead of using the technology to increase production until really the Crimean War. So then you have Tsar Alexander II. Tsar Alexander II is significant first and foremost because he will free the serfs in 1861. He wants to grow Russia's economy. Serfs will be granted land, but no new political rights, and will still be tied to their villages until they can pay for the land they were granted. This doesn't really solve the problem, right? He's essentially made them sharecroppers. So the discontent grows worse. You have a huge population of unskilled, uneducated peasants, and the population increased because of an increase in calories thanks to the introduction of the potato all those years ago. So 23 million serfs were made legally free by this decree. The ex-serfs would finally be allowed to own property, to marry by choice, because before, if you wanted to get married, you had to get the permission of your landlord. They could trade freely. They could sue in courts, vote in local elections, move hypothetically. However, to appease his nobles, they also had to make redemption payments where they had to buy the land assigned to them from their previous owners' estates. Alexander also tried to institute some local government, the Zemitovs, these local councils which would regulate roads, schools, and policies for the local peasants. The emancipation of the serfs aided in changing Russia from a predominantly agricultural to a slightly more industrial society with a labor force, but it will not lead to increased agricultural productivity. The peasants are still highly unskilled in using outdated agricultural methods. All right, they're not using tractors. They are using hand tools. Well, the Zemitovs will replace the nobles' authority over the serfs and give some voice to the middle class. But none of these actions will limit the Tsar's power. He will increase modernization in Russia, building the Trans-Siberian Railroad to connect Europe to the Pacific coast. Intellectually, we see that universities start to reform, scholars and scientists are allowed to think and speak more freely, and they start making an impact. And yet, despite his efforts to modernize Russia, social protests increase. You see the use of the pogroms, violent riots aimed to massacre or persecute the Jews. This will lead to a lot of Jewish emigration as they flee into Western Europe and to the United States. You see lots of frustrated peasants who are now been told, you can improve your life, but they have no actual means to do so. Business and professional people, as well as the intelligentsia, become more active in demanding more reforms. And many of the Russian radicals were frankly anarchists. So all of this chaos that's going to emerge from his attempt to modernize will really start to make Alexander a little nervous. He does decide, though, or there is a sense that he was moving towards a constitutional monarchy, but it doesn't matter. He'll be assassinated by anarchists in 1881, and Tsar Alexander III and Tsar Nicholas II, our last two Tsars, will take power after his death, and both of them will be vehemently opposed to political reform. Please watch the History of Russia video on Alexander II. They have one on like every Tsar. Okay, please compare Russia to Western Europe. Why is it the way it is? Let's do a couple practice questions. So here's the source. Pause the video and watch it or read it. The expansion of the Russian Empire in the late 18th and 19th centuries is primarily explained in the context of which of the following global developments? The second paragraph best provides information about the way in which states in the 19th century in its description of the condition of the Crimean Tatars, the second paragraph most directly provides evidence of the influence of which of the following? Please explain how various economic factors contributed to the development of the global economy. I also want you to think about how did the global economy impact the development or decline of Russia and the Ottomans. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great day.